Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in this world. This is John West back with you with Japanese Business and Economy. Yes, John West back with you with Japanese Business and Economy. And now we're going to look at Class 6 and the first section of Class 6, so Class 6A. And we're looking at the trade and investment solution to Japan's challenges. Now, in our previous classes, we've analysed in some depth Japan's challenges. Japan's main challenges are its weak productivity compared with other advanced countries like the US, Germany, its ageing population, and its large government debt. So in this class and the classes that follow, we'll be looking at solutions to Japan's challenges. How does Japan fix its problems? And free and open trade is certainly one solution to Japan's weak productivity. Now, as we discussed in an earlier class, free and open trade offers many benefits to countries that practice it. Firstly, you specialise in what you're best at, what economists call comparative advantage. Secondly, there are economies of scale. When you're trading on world markets, you're producing more than otherwise. And the more you produce, the more efficient you are. The more that you produce, the lower your unit costs are. Thirdly, when you are competing on global markets, companies learn global best practices. They need to learn global best practices to survive, to be able to sell to customers, to be able to compete with other companies. And lastly, for a country like Japan, exports finance imports. Japan is a country that needs imports of natural resources that it lacks. But it needs to finance these imports somehow, and exports provide the finance for these imports of natural resources. In short, free and open trade pushes a country's productivity higher and would be very, very beneficial to Japan today. After Japan's protectionist past, surprisingly, today, Japan is becoming a champion of free and open trade. Now, you will remember that back in Japan's high growth period from 1945 through to about 1990, Japan employed protectionist policies to help infant industries become competitive. And in fact, this policy was very successful for manufacturing, companies like Toyota and so on. These companies that competed on world markets and of course learned global best practices. But this protectionist policy was not very effective for services or agriculture. These two sectors were focused on the local Japanese market, didn't compete on world markets, and therefore did not become competitive. Now, at the time of Japan's bubble economy in the early 1990s, it should have removed all of its protection. Manufacturing didn't need it anymore. Most of Japan's manufacturing were world leaders. They were very competitive. And in the case of agriculture and services, these two sectors needed to be opened up to international competition to become more efficient. But once protectionist policies are in place, they are very difficult to remove for political reasons. What happens is that the beneficiaries of protectionist policies fight to keep those protectionist policies. They like being protected. They like being protected in their inefficiency. And of course, they lobby politicians to keep their protection. Now, back in the 80s and 90s, the US and other countries pushed Japan to open its markets. Japan did a little, but not so much. They also pushed Japan to invest in their economies, and it did a lot. And we'll come back to that later on. Now, as part of Abenomics, this program of Prime Minister Abe to revitalise the Japanese economy, Japan joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade talks led by US President Obama. These trade talks involved about 12 countries around the Pacific and promised to open up trade amongst these countries. Now, this was a brave and courageous decision by Mr. Abe to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, the TPP, because there are many people in Japan who were not keen on this, who opposed this, people benefiting from protection. But he could see that joining the TPP was an important part of Abenomics, and it was important to align himself with the US politically. Now, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a vast enterprise. There's much more to it than just trade liberalization. It deals with services, electronic commerce, telecommunications, competition policy, state-owned enterprises, intellectual property, government procurement, transparency, anti-corruption, labor rights, and the environment. And you can see already in this list how important and significant it is. China has never been a party to the TPP talks, and it could not in its current state. For example, in China, state-owned enterprises are a very, very important part of the economy, a very important part of the state capitalism that the Communist Party practices. And so reforming state-owned enterprises would not be accepted by China. However, all the countries signed up to the TPP signed up to reform of state-owned enterprises. Labor rights, trade unions, the right of workers to get together in trade unions. This is an important part of the TPP. And countries like Vietnam actually signed up to this, but China would never sign up to a trade agreement that involved labor rights for trade unions. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to have trade unions as an alternative source of power, perhaps criticizing the Communist Party. So this really is a very open, competitive enterprise, the TPP. Now, the TPP was actually successfully negotiated and agreed during the term of President Obama. However, in the US political system, trade agreements like the TPP must be ratified by the US Congress. And unfortunately, it didn't make it through the Congress in time to be ratified. And so under President Obama, the TPP just sat there on the shelf. The TPP, in fact, became a big issue in the Donald Trump, in the election campaign when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton. And neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump liked the TPP. So when Donald Trump was elected, he in fact withdrew the US from the TPP, I think on the very first day of his presidency. And you can see this photo there in front of on the screen. This shows us Donald Trump proudly withdrawing the US from the TPP, even though this was a US-led trade talks, even though a lot of the TPP provisions were in fact designed by US business. US business had a lot to gain, but Donald Trump, the populist, who was against anything that anyone else did, who was against anything that President Obama did, of course, pulled the US out of this. Now, from the Japanese point of view, US withdrawal from the TPP was betrayal, because Japan joined up the TPP in part under pressure from the US to do so. The US was keen to have Japan part of the TPP to open up the Japanese market. And then the US withdraws. Now, in a remarkable act of leadership, I should say that when Donald Trump pulled out of the TPP, most people thought that the TPP would be dead, that nothing would happen to it after that. Now, in a remarkable act of leadership, Japan, under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, picked up the TPP, got together with the remaining countries, 10 plus Japan, and said, hey, let's salvage this TPP. Let's keep the TPP alive. And so Japan picked up the TPP and led a rapid renegotiation with the other members of the TPP. And in fact, they agreed on a revised version of the TPP, pretty similar to the original version, but a little bit different. And this revised version of the TPP came into force on December the 30th, 2018. Now, this is a remarkable thing, and it shows the remarkable leadership of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Now, this revised, agreed TPP is officially known as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for a TPP. In shorthand, we say TPP 11. Now, the TPP 11, of course, is not nearly as big as it was when the Americans were part of it, and not nearly as significant or important as it was when the Americans were part of it. But the TPP 11 is still something. It is still important. And it creates a bloc covering 500 million people. That's a large slab of the world's population. It covers 11 trillion US dollars in GDP. That's around 14% of the world's total GDP. And so the remaining countries which are members of the TPP are Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico. And I should say that we have 2 Mexican students in our class. I'm very happy about that. So Mexico is part of the TPP, Peru, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam. And so I've got a nice little YouTube for you to watch about the TPP 11.
From Vietnam, and this avocado from Mexico. Soon, all these fruits will get cheaper, but only for consumers in 11 countries. That's because of the world's biggest trade deal since NAFTA. The TPP-11, or the CPTPP, is the world's newest trade deal. It was signed by 11 countries on March 8. CPTPP stands for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a mouthful, but it sounds familiar, doesn't it? This trade deal was previously known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and included the United States. The TPP deal had been signed in 2016, but American President Donald Trump withdrew the U.S. on his 3rd day in the job.
Great thing for the American worker.
Many experts thought that meant the end of the TPP. Without the U.S., the TPP-11's share of global GDP went from 38% to about 13.5%. But the 11 countries, led by Japan, surprised experts and pushed through the deal. It's now the world's 3rd biggest trade bloc by GDP. Many people are excited about the CPTPP because it's seen as a high-quality trade deal. That's because the CPTPP involves deep, fast tariff cuts, and a lot of them. It also includes many areas not typically covered in trade agreements. I think you'll be pleased to know that avocados are part of the deal. At the moment, countries like Japan, Mexico, Malaysia, and Vietnam have avocado tariffs. But with the TPP, avocado tariffs will fall in most countries. And for Vietnam, the slowest to implement cuts, it will fall to 0% in 4 years. This means that avocados from TPP countries will likely be cheaper than those from non-TPP countries. So it seems that consumers are the biggest winners in this trade deal. Are there other winners and losers? Well, all the TPP countries are expecting significant economic benefits. New Zealand estimated a boost of between 880 million and 2.9 billion, while Canada will get a boost of 3.2 billion. But Japan is a clear winner. Other than economic benefits, it sees the CPTPP as a geopolitical strategy to counter another trade pact in negotiations, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The RCEP is seen as a deal backed by China and makes up nearly half of the global population. Farmers and food exporting countries like Mexico, Australia, and New Zealand are also seen as big winners, as agricultural produce is usually left out of trade deals. Service sectors aren't typically included either, but the TPP-11 does include them. This means more firms such as accounting, design, and tourism services benefit from market access across 11 countries. However, there are many who still see themselves as possible losers of the TPP-11. For instance, the jury is still out in Canada about benefits for companies there. While it will enjoy access to new markets like Japan, some industries such as dairy and automobile think that the concessions outweigh the benefits. Workers in developed economies are likely to be fearful that firms will move production to lower wage countries. However, the TPP-11 has rules on labor rights, meaning less developed countries will have to abide by international standards, including the minimum wage. But how countries will implement this is still up in the air. And some economists say it's the United States that's losing out. According to one think tank, the CPTPP would have raised U.S. wages, grown exports by 9.1%, and increased U.S. real incomes by $131 billion a year to 2030. Delaying the launch of the TPP was projected in 2016 to be a $77 billion loss to the U.S. economy. But Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz echoed the sentiments of many Americans, warning that the original TPP-12 helps only big corporations. But even Donald Trump is becoming more open to the party he declined to join.
If we did a substantially better deal, I would be open to TPP.
The CPTPP is likely to come into force by the end of this year. It's a strong signal to the U.S. that despite growing calls for protectionism, 11 countries and many more are looking to throw in their lot with free trade. Hi, thanks for watching. If you want to see more CNBC Explains, click on the videos here and here. Don't forget to subscribe and see you next time.
So there you have it, the TPP-11. It's a very important trade agreement and very important for Japan, the subject of our study, in terms of offering the opportunity to lift Japan's productivity. Now, Japan has been involved in other trade talks too, which have also been very fruitful. Now, trade talks began between Japan and the European Union back in 2013. And because during Mr. Abe's time as leader of Japan, he was always worried about protectionism from Donald Trump, protectionism from the United States, he jumped on these trade talks that had begun back in 2013 and pushed them through. And so on the 1st of February 2019, the EU, European Union, Japan Economic Partnership Agreement came into force. The Free Trade Agreement, Economic Partnership Agreement between the European Union and Japan came into force 1 February 2019. As I said, this was inspired by the fear of protectionism from Donald Trump. Now, this is also a very important trade deal. The economic zone covered by this free trade agreement covers 635 million people. Secondly, it covers 30% of world GDP and 40% of world trade. So once again, this is a very important agreement, and of course offers great opportunities for improving Japan's productivity. Now, the European agreement is again a wide-ranging agreement. It covers trade in goods, trade in services, bilateral investment. There'll be increased access to the European market for Japanese car manufacturers. Of course, we know that Japanese car manufacturers are among the most efficient in the world. And European exporters will benefit dramatically from reduced Japanese agricultural import tariffs. And I know that when this agreement came into force, many of my Japanese friends were very excited about getting French wine and French cheese much cheaper than they did before. Now, Brussels, the capital of the European Union, estimates that there are savings for European Union firms of €1 billion a year in customs duties. Overall, the European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement removes 97% of tariffs that Japan applies to European goods and removes 99% of those applied by the European Union.
Signed, sealed, and more goods set to be delivered. As Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and EU leaders made the landmark trade deal official, the path widened for more than $100 billion worth of products and services traded between the two to increase.
This will create a GDP worth about $45 billion and 290,000 jobs for Japan. which will become the new engine of Abenomics.
Set to take effect late next year, the deal removes tariffs on nearly all EU exports to Japan. Meanwhile, Japanese car makers stand to gain from reduced duties on vehicles and auto parts. The deal is expected to give Europe's agricultural and food products a major boost. Exports of European cheese, wine, and pork are among some products set to jump. It will also bring Japanese trade rules in line with international standards, aimed at increasing transparency and market access. Taking place against the backdrop of an ongoing trade war between the United States and China, officials from both the EU and Japan praised the deal as a win for free trade and multilateralism.
This is an act of enormous strategic importance for the rules-based international order at a time when some are questioning this order. We are sending a clear message that we stand together against protectionism.
Analysts say the deal could further isolate the US economy, which is flexing its America First policy in full force, a move many worry could still be strong enough to bring global growth to a standstill. Laila Humaira, TRT World.
So there it is, the European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement. Once again, a very important initiative that will help improve Japan's productivity. Now, much more recently, in fact, in recent months, Japan is also a signatory to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. I repeat, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. This is the biggest trade bloc in history. RCEP includes the 10 members of ASEAN, Southeast Asia, being Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, Singapore and Brunei, and 5 partner countries of ASEAN, being Australia, China, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. Now, this 15-member bloc, this 15-member country agreement, RCEP, accounts for about 30% of the world's population, 2.2 billion people, and covers 30% of global GDP, $26.2 trillion. Now, RCEP unifies the pre-existing bilateral agreements between 10 member ASEAN countries and 5 of its major trading partners. It was signed just recently on the 15th of November in 2020, and it will come into force 60 days after it's been ratified by at least 6 ASEAN countries and 3 non-ASEAN signatories. So it is not in force yet. It has to be ratified by a certain number of countries from ASEAN and also the non-ASEAN countries. Now, compared with the CPTPP, the TPP-11, RCEP is actually a much lower ambition agreement. But nevertheless, it is important and is expected to eliminate about 90% of the tariffs on imports between its signatories within 20 years of coming into force. It's also expected to establish common rules for e-commerce, electronic commerce, and intellectual property. Unified rules of origin will also help facilitate international supply chains and reduce export costs through the bloc. What is pretty important actually about RCEP is that it's the first free trade agreement between China, Indonesia, Japan, and South Korea, 4 of the largest economies in Asia. And so everyone is hopeful that this will provide a boost to trade and a boost to productivity. Now, at the time that it was signed, many analysts predicted that it would help stimulate the economy in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this is an important initiative because through the COVID pandemic, we've seen a rise in protectionist pressures, countries trying to protect their economies as the economy's been hit by the pandemic. And so this RCEP agreement will be an important initiative to stimulate the economy and fight back against protectionism. And also importantly, It will pull the economic center of gravity back towards Asia. The US is not a member of this agreement. It hasn't expressed interest in this agreement, but this is a bad thing for the US if the US is serious about being part of the Asia Pacific. And so many people believe that the RCEP will amplify the decline of the United States in economic and political affairs. We, of course, have to see what happens under the new President Biden, but he has lots of work to do to restore the US as an important player in the Asia Pacific. So, and again, I have a little YouTube for you on what is RCEP.
A group of 15 countries generating nearly a third of global economic output have signed the world's largest ever free trade deal. It's a historic agreement that will have economic implications far beyond the region's borders and signals a seismic geopolitical shift, not only for the countries that are part of the deal, but also the ones that aren't. The RCEP stands for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and when ratified, will create a trading bloc rivaling the European Union and the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. 10 of its members make up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, which include Malaysia and Singapore. The remaining 5 countries are Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and most notably, China. The world's largest free trade deal covers a market of 2.2 billion people, or around a third of the world's population. Its members are responsible for $26.2 trillion of economic output, accounting for roughly 30% of global GDP. While the RCEP is the latest in a long line of trade agreements coming out of Asia, it wasn't supposed to be the biggest. Negotiations for the RCEP trade deal started back in 2013, but it attracted renewed interest in 2017 when President Donald Trump pulled the US out of a rival Asia-Pacific grouping that excluded China.
Great thing for the American worker, what we just did.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, would have involved 12 countries, covering 40% of the world economy. While both the RCEP and the TPP were intended to create free and open markets, the TPP had more ambitious goals, covering stricter common standards on labor issues, human rights, and environmental protection. The scuttled TPP Pact was revived under a new guise involving the 11 remaining countries, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, in 2018. Because China was excluded from the US-led TPP, observers have described the RCEP as a way for China to counter American influence in the region while writing the rules that govern trade in the 21st century. However, some analysts feel that the economic benefits of the RCEP are limited and could take decades to fully materialize. That's because many members of RCEP have already signed bilateral trade deals and benefit from reduced tariffs. Critics include Australia's former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull.
There'll be some hoopla about the signing and the entry into force of RCEP. I mean, RCEP is a really low ambition trade deal, but we shouldn't kid ourselves.
The biggest impact could be the new rules of origin, which officially determine where a product was made. These essentially eliminate tariffs on goods traded between member states, providing greater simplicity than a series of bilateral free trade agreements, especially for companies with global supply chains. Take, for example, a company in Thailand building tractors for a client in Indonesia. The two countries are part of the ASEAN Free Trade Zone, but because some parts of the tractor are made in Australia, Indonesia might charge a tariff on the finished machine. The RCEP will remove barriers like this, adding an incentive for members to look within the bloc for suppliers. The trade deal could also lay the foundations for stronger economic partnerships in the future, particularly between members that don't already have free trade deals, as is the case with China, Japan, and South Korea. The 3 East Asian nations have been in negotiations over a free trade deal since 2002 without reaching an agreement. Both Japan and South Korea have close economic and security ties with the US, unlike their contentious diplomatic relationship with China. And despite rocky political relations between the communist state and Australia, the two have signed up to the deal. The RCEP is China's first multilateral free trade agreement, which analysts say is a political victory as much as an economic one. The deal comes at a time when the US and China have locked horns over a number of issues, including the South China Sea, supply chains, and 5G networks. Without US involvement in the agreement, China could sidestep pressure for major economic reforms or reform of intellectual property rights. Companies which were already shifting supply chains away from China due to the country's trade war with the US may still be able to source products from the country under the new agreement. The RCEP could also strengthen China's global infrastructure strategy, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, while reducing US commercial activity in the region. While the deal was originally conceived by ASEAN, China is set to gain the most financially from RCEP, followed by Japan and South Korea. The direct economic benefits for the 10 Southeast Asian nations may be limited due to their existing free trade accords, with more than 70% of trade inside the bloc already conducted with zero tariffs. Not only is the deal likely to diminish the United States' influence in the region, but it could also cause it to miss out on over $100 billion worth of trade. Another country expected to forego a large amount of income is India. The South Asian nation was initially involved in the RCEP negotiations, but dropped out in 2019 over concerns that the deal would result in a flood of cheap imports that would hurt Indian businesses across many industries. There are concerns among members that without India, the smaller Asian countries will be more reliant on China, and in turn, Beijing will have more leverage in the region. How Chinese President Xi Jinping steers the world's second largest economy in the trade bloc will be watched closely. The adverse effects of the South China Sea dispute and the COVID-19 pandemic may lead to a more amicable approach to diplomacy that reassures its neighbors. However, a China-first strategy cannot be ruled out. For the US, its trade policies are affected by the shifting tides of domestic politics. Trump's America First policies have seen the omission of the US from two of the world's largest trade deals, leaving a political and economic vacuum in the Asia-Pacific region. It may take many years for the benefits of the RCEP to be fully realized. But the announcement of the deal signals that although several leading Western countries have adopted isolationist policies, many Asian nations, and China in particular, are increasingly committed to better trade links, which could shape the economic and political landscape for years to come. Hi guys, thanks for watching our video. Please subscribe to the channel, but before you do, we'd love to know your ideas for videos for the new year. So please comment below the video to let us know, and we'll see you next.
So that's RCEP. And it may be a deal which is not very ambitious, but it is still important. And it signals that Asia is looking outward, looking towards international trade at a time when the US is looking more inward. So these trade deals, the TPP-11, the Japan, European Union Economic Partnership Agreement, and now the RCEP. These are three deals that Japan is a part of, an important part of, and this signals a great change in Japan on the international scene. You know, back in the 1970s and 1980s, Japan was regarded as a trade villain by most Western countries because it refused to open its markets. Now, over the past decade, these trade deals that we've been talking about, the TPP-11, the Europe-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, and now the RCEP, this shows that Japan actually has become a champion of free trade, a great supporter and promoter of free trade. This promises to help improve Japan's low productivity. And so for those of us concerned about the future of Japan, these trade agreements are a very positive thing. Importantly, however, none of these trade agreements will result in free trade. We call them free trade agreements, but they're not really free trade agreements. They're agreements that merely reduce the barriers to international trade, that make trade freer, but not free. And so looking ahead, much work needs to be done to improve the ambition of these free trade agreements and make them truly free trade agreements. And in the case of Japan, much more also needs to be done to improve its productivity. But what we've seen happen in the free trade area is very, very positive. So thank you once again. Arigatou gozaimasu. It's been great to have you with me for this session on free and open trade as one solution to Japan's challenges. And so again, thank you. It's been great to have you with me. If you have any comments, questions, reactions to this, this lesson, please send me an email. I'd be delighted to receive it. And of course, in mid-January, when we get together for our student discussion groups, we can discuss these issues too. So once again, for the moment, I'd like to say thank you, bye-bye, and bye-bye.